Computer.
All right. I think we're good to go whenever you are.
Mm-hmm.
We'll give people a chance. Everyone's running for lunch.
Hello, everyone. We're just going to give everyone a couple of minutes to join us. While we wait for people to get settled, feel free to say hi in the chat and let us know where you're joining us from today.
Hello, hi, this is also. I'm joining from OPP in Mississauga, Ontario.
Nice to meet you.
Great.
Thank you for joining
Glad you
us.
could be here.
Just give it another couple minutes, but as I said before, if you're just getting on, we're letting people get settled. Feel free to say hi in the chat and let us know where you're calling in from.
Well, lots of people rolling in.
All right, I think we're good to get started then. So, everyone, welcome to today's session. The webinar is called Prevention 101, and it's hosted by the Canadian Observatory on Homelessness. Our organization is a global thought leader on homelessness prevention, and we work in collaboration with our partners to conduct and mobilize research designed to have an impact on solutions to homelessness. Today's webinar will be hosted by our president and CEO, Dr. Stephen Gaetz. Dr. Gaetz is a professor in the Faculty of Education at York University in Toronto, Canada. He is the president of the Canadian Observatory on Homelessness and the Homeless Hub at York University, as well as co-director of Making the Shift, the Youth Homelessness Social Innovation Lab, and the United Nations Center of Excellence on Youth Homelessness Prevention in Toronto. Dr. Gaetz works in collaboration with partners to conduct and research and mobilize his knowledge so as to have a greater impact on solutions to homelessness, and in particular, the prevention of homelessness. In 2017, Dr. Gaetz was awarded the Member of Order of Canada. Today, he will be outlining our homelessness prevention framework, which is adapted from the public health model. There will be time for questions at the end, so please feel free to ask questions using the Q&A feature or simply leave your questions in the chat box below at any point during the session. The session will be recorded, so if you would like to maintain your privacy, I'll invite you now to turn off your video and rename yourself using the tools at the bottom of the screen. Since we're gathering online today, a single land acknowledgement doesn't capture the richness of our many locations. The Canadian Observatory on Homelessness is based in York University, Toronto, so that's the land acknowledgement we'll be sharing, but we invite all guests to consider their position regarding the land in which they find themselves. We acknowledge our presence on the traditional territory of many Indigenous nations. The area known as Toronto has been caretaken by the Anishinaabe Nation, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and the Huron-Wendat. It is now home to many First Nation, Inuit, and Métis communities. We acknowledge the current treaty holders, the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. This territory is subject of the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement to peaceably share and care for the Great Lakes region. I'd now like to welcome Dr. Gaetz to the floor. Thank you for joining us today, and we look forward to hearing your insights.
Thank you very much, and welcome everyone. Delighted to see a number of people show up here, and it's great to see the interest in prevention because 10 years ago, if we'd done something like this, we probably would get about 12 people to show up. So it's an interesting thing. Now I'm going to share my screen here, if I can do that. Here we go. And we'll begin. So what I'm going to do is start with, basically letting everyone know what is involved with this presentation and what's going to happen next. What we're doing here is we're thrilled to announce that we're launching Prevention Matters, which is a new online series to delve into the questions of homelessness prevention. What is it and how do we deal with it? For these sessions, we're going to want audience participation. They'll take different formats. In some cases, it'll be like a talk show format, that kind of thing. But we want people to engage with this material and learn and enjoy and contribute. We're going to meet monthly. And so the first session after this one will take place and focus on Black youth homelessness prevention to commemorate Black History Month. So do tune into that. We'll be sending out messages throughout the year as the different presentations line up. We're going to be sharing with a large range of people from different places in the world who've been working on this body of work. So we're very excited. So just stay tuned. Now I'm going to move to the presentation part here. We've titled it Homelessness Presentation 101. So a good place to start with this is to answer the question like, why prevention? Because, the focus on homelessness can take many forms. And do we need prevention when we have the crisis that we do now with so many people that are currently homeless? And I mentioned before that if we did this 10 years ago, there probably wouldn't be much interest, but things have changed. Like North America, for the longest time, prevention, if not a dirty word, was something to be ignored, or we'll get around to prevention once we've solved chronic homelessness, that kind of thing. And so it's important to see where prevention fits in the broad spectrum of work that we need to do around homelessness. So many of you will have seen this before. When in addressing homelessness, we need to think about three things. First, can we prevent it? Can we stop people from becoming homeless in the first place? Second, we'll need some kind of emergency or crisis response because bad things, even if you have good prevention, bad things can happen to people. And then third, housing and support. So helping people exit homelessness with the right kind of supports and housing that's safe, affordable, and adequate. I've done the diagram like this to emphasize the emergency response because that has been, since modern mass homelessness emerged in the late 80s, early 90s, that has been the major focus of our response to homelessness. And that's where most of the investment is in. That's where most of the staff, most of the energy is. And emergency response is important, but we have to think about other ways of dealing with the issue. I go back to, we've had lots of devastating fires in Canada in recent years because of climate change. There was a fire in Kelowna, I remember, in like 2003. And what they did is people were displaced, so they moved people into hockey rinks and had mats on there, and people got sandwiches and that kind of thing. And That was an emergency response because people were suddenly left homeless because of the fire. But if we were to go back today, 21 years later, and there were still people in that hockey rink on cots, I think we could really question our efforts. And I kind of feel that's how it is with homelessness, is that we certainly need the emergency response, and the people doing that work are doing important work, but we need to do more. And so there are other compelling reasons to think about doing things differently. Eric Latimer, who's an economist at McGill University and was part of At Home Chez Soi, he did an analysis of data looking at what does it cost to keep someone in a state of homelessness for 1 year, for 12 months. And so here's what he came up with looking at the data. If you could see here, Toronto, where I live outside of, it's $59,000 a year. The rest range from 29,000 to 56,000. And if you think about that, that's a pretty compelling figure. That means the cost of people in emergency services, but also people wind up in emergency room more often if they're homeless. So the cost of healthcare is greater. And also there was more engagement with the criminal justice system because we use policing to address homelessness in many communities. And of course, a jail cell is the most expensive form of housing and shelter in Canada. And so we often say, well, we can't do things like prevention because it's just like we're doing the best we can. We don't have the funds. And in fact, there's a lot of money, public money, that goes into supporting this approach to homelessness. And think about what you could do with $59,000 with a person. You could pay for the rent, even in high rent places, and give people supports they need. So we have to start asking questions differently. So I mentioned that the emergency response is where most of our energy is, but there's been a paradigm shift beginning in the United States around the turn of the last century, where we came up with an approach that actually has a lot of good elements to it. The first is housing first. Housing first is one of the few evidence-based interventions for homelessness, and there's a huge amount of research evidence backing its efficacy. And so that's a good thing. We should be doing housing first. In fact, even now, over 20 years since Samson Barris really kind of worked out the kinks of housing first, we're not doing enough of it. The other thing that needs to be done is optimize the homelessness sector to deliver housing first. That's important too. I agree with that. People shouldn't, every time they show up in a shelter, tell their story again and again and again. We need to treat the homelessness sector as a system. And then finally, targeting chronically homeless people to get the housing first support first. Now, all of these things are absolutely important and I support. I just want to state that up front. These are really important things, but we have told ourselves that if we just do this, we'll solve homelessness. Now, all of these things have to be part of our response to homelessness, but I don't think it's sufficient. We can't end homelessness unless we look at some other pieces of work. So how do I say that? Well, I'm going to show you some data from the United States from point in time counts of chronically homeless individuals from 2007 to 2020. I don't have updated data on it, but I suspect that the numbers are greater. So you can see here in 2007, 120,000 people were chronically homeless, and it declined to 2016 by about 50,000, and then has been creeping back up since then. And so that's important. It shows that some progress was made, but then the progress started to dissipate. So I put that success down to a number of things, but the main thing I would say that happened here is if we look at veterans homelessness. Under Barack Obama, there was a massive investment in ending veterans homelessness, particularly chronic homelessness. And there was a goal to reduce it by 100%. They've reduced it by 50. So they spent some money, used housing first, and succeeded in creating a major drop in the figures, which showed up in the chronic homelessness data. But here's the thing. The reason why they were so successful with housing first, or with addressing veterans homelessness, is because in the United States, Veterans Affairs is its own integrated system. It has housing, it has employment supports, it has healthcare supports, it has hospitals, it has income supports. So you're able to mobilize an integrated system to tackle this problem. The challenge is that kind of integration doesn't exist outside of Veterans Affairs in the United States. It doesn't exist in Canada, right? We could mobilize all of those things to address homelessness. You know, we could mandate that hospitals do their bit to make sure people are discharged in homelessness. We could do that kind of work directing different public institutions to do their bit, but there's been a lot to do. So, as I said, housing first, coordinated access, targeting chronically homeless people is important, but it's not sufficient. And the reason that I can say that is even most recent data in the United States shows the numbers are increasing because there are more entries into homelessness than exits. So we need to change what we're thinking here from, this kind of model to something that looks more like this, where we rebalance the investment and the effort, focusing on housing and supports, things like housing first, expand that, and focusing on prevention, so stopping the inflow into homelessness. So defining, if you're going to do prevention, you have to be able to define what it is. It can't be everything. And that's the problem with, if you don't have solid definitions, people have things like, housing first, emergency shelter is a concept that I don't really understand. Seems contradictory, that kind of thing. So you need to have clarity about what it is you're trying to do. So in 2016, we wrote this report that was an effort to do, from our perspective, put together a solid definition of homelessness prevention with a topology. Our thinking has evolved a lot since then. We've learned a lot. There's been efforts in Europe to create their own definition of homelessness prevention. So our knowledge has advanced through time, and our knowledge of how to do it has advanced too. Now, to think about homelessness prevention, you have to start by thinking of it as a fusion policy issue, right? It's not going to be done and addressed just by the homelessness sector. Different parts of government are contributing to the problem of homelessness and should be at the table in terms of solutions. So obviously, like child protection, justice, immigration, healthcare, mental health, all of these things need to be mobilized as part of the solution, because the one thing that's clear, we cannot prevent homelessness if it's all the responsibility of the homelessness sector. It also means we can't end homelessness if it's only the responsibility of the homelessness sector. So in developing our updated definition, this is a new version, an enhancement of what we had talked about before. We decided to really double down on the public health definition of prevention, which is the oldest and has been adapted and modified for criminal justice and dropping out and different things like that. And at its base level, it's a really helpful way to think about things. So in healthcare, primary prevention means working upstream in order to increase population health and help people avoid illness, right? So you're working upstream to make sure people don't get sick or hurt. The secondary prevention addresses when people have become sick or hurt, ensuring that the condition doesn't worsen, but rather improves. And tertiary prevention is helping people to manage long-term complicated health problems or to avoid the recurrence of illness and injury. So what does this look like if we translate that into addressing homelessness, right? What we're talking about here are policies, practices, and interventions designed to achieve the following. First, reduce inflows into homelessness. In other words, stop people from becoming homeless in the first place. The third one I'll go to, and then the second. Tertiary prevention is reduce the likelihood that those who exit homelessness will return to it. So that's where housing first is really important. The second one is new, and it gives, I think, some clear direction to the homelessness sector. The secondary prevention refers to reducing the risk that those who are recently homeless transition to long-term or chronic homelessness. We know from data in Canada and the United States that for every 100 people that show up at a shelter for the first time, maybe 80% will resolve their own homelessness, sometimes within weeks. 20% won't, and they will transition to chronicity. Now, our challenge is we don't have mechanisms to identify those who show up at the shelter and are reasonably likely to become chronically homeless, I should say. And so that's an important piece of work for us to figure out what can we do there so that every entry into a shelter is at the same time a step away and back into housing. So these are the kind of things we'll look for in the future. Now, in defining homelessness prevention, we also talk about what homeless prevention is not. So things that happen in emergency shelters, cooking programs, employment training, that kind of thing, may be preventing something, but they're not preventing homeless if the person is still homeless during getting those supports and after. If it isn't tied to a housing option and an exit from homelessness, it's not prevention. Likewise, community-based programs and services that support marginalized people who are at risk of many things, but they're not imminently at risk of homelessness. We can't call that homelessness prevention. Not everyone who is low income is going to become homeless. There is increased likelihood that they may, but it's not a guarantee. So we have to be able to target our prevention efforts, not have just general investments in supports for community organizations. And we also have to take account of homelessness and prevention amongst Indigenous people. This is something that we've really enhanced in our new thinking about prevention, right? Given that Indigenous people we know are overrepresented in the homelessness population, we need to understand, what does homelessness mean to Indigenous people and what does prevention mean to Indigenous people? Indigenous people will tell you that due to the history of an ongoing experience of racism and colonialism, that people's homelessness isn't defined just by a structure, or people being housed is not defined just by a structure. Homelessness from an Indigenous perspective involves many more things that lead people to feel distant and alienated from the land, from their culture, and from opportunities to thrive. And so we need to really work to understand what would prevention of Indigenous homelessness mean, and in doing this, take the lead from our Indigenous partners and support our Indigenous partners and ensure that we have Indigenous-led approaches to this problem. Okay, checking the time here. So we have the definition. We also have a typology where there are 5 levels here. We'll go through these fairly quickly because we want to make sure we have time for conversation. So structural prevention means working way upstream to address underlying structural factors. Here's a list of them. I won't read them all out, but the second one I think is important. Owen O'Sullivan, who's the head of the European Observatory on Homelessness, has been doing some research across Europe, and the number one factor that determines and predicts homelessness is the lack of affordable housing, and deeply affordable housing in particular. But these other things we have to address as well, because they're all interlinked, right? So, addressing the legacy of colonialism and ongoing racism with Indigenous people, preventing adverse childhood experiences, breaking the link between homelessness, migration, and displacement. All of these things are important. But one thing you should note is that none of those can be solved by the homelessness sector. That's where higher orders of government have to take a leading role. We can't just put the whole burden of solving this problem on a sector that isn't designed to address that. So that's an important point. The second thing, part of the typology, is systems prevention. So how can public systems be transformed to support homelessness prevention? One is we need to work with those public systems that exit people into homelessness. So certainly youth leaving care is one great example of that. The percentage of young people in Canada who have some involvement with child protection is about 0.3%. The percent of young people experiencing homelessness who had child protection involvement is 58%. So there's a pipeline there. There's a lot of interesting conversations and work going on in Canada right now and elsewhere in the world to try and address how can we help young people transition from care in ways that do not lead them to become homeless. Exiting corrections is the same thing. We know from research that if you discharge someone from prison into homelessness, the likelihood that they reoffend will go up. And likewise, when we discharge people from inpatient mental health, addictions, and healthcare services, whatever they went into the hospital for may get much worse. So all of these are public system questions that call into the role of the public systems in rethinking their approach to discharging people when it leads to homelessness. We also need to enhance a person's experience of public systems, right? Which means that people need to have services and supports that are appropriate, accessible, available, affordable, and I would add non-discriminatory. So early intervention is the next stage. So here we're talking about helping people who are very imminently at risk of becoming homeless. And so people who maybe have been served a notice of eviction, things like that, where there are breakdowns in family, these kinds of things, dropping out, all of these things are predictors and are important. And so there are good examples with evidence in Canada and the United States and in Europe for the efficacy of these kind of approaches. We're learning a lot more about evictions prevention for youth. The research is showing that enhancing family and natural support so that people have long-term adult supports in their life will pay big benefits and should be part of everything we do with young people experiencing homelessness. And then school-based early interventions. This is something that Australia developed where they thought, you know, it doesn't make sense to build a bunch of youth homeless shelters. Why don't we try stopping them from becoming homeless in the first place? And so there's research on all of these things out there that are interesting. Many of these have been implemented in Canada. There are good examples of these in Canada for people to learn from and adapt. Crisis prevention. So this takes it one step further. So it's one thing to have a notice of eviction. It's another thing to be kicked out of your apartment, right? And have nowhere to go. And so what do we do when people are in this situation? And so there's been work done, this is adapted from Fitzpatrick et al. And Lee et al. In Europe, looking at what we should do when people show up at shelters or are in that troubled place. The first is to reduce dependency on shelters. The second is focus on minimizing the duration of homelessness, because the research is conclusive that the prolonged exposure to homelessness has a major negative impact on health and well-being. We need to secure tenancies, right? So part of that solution for people who are imminently at risk of homelessness or who have become homeless is to make sure they get housing stabilized as soon as possible. And then this last one is a new one that is tied to our secondary prevention. We need to target wraparound supports for those at risk of transitioning to chronicity. So cover all the bases, help everyone. And so in Canada, we've seen the growth in shelter diversion, and there's some really great examples in Canada, like Waterloo Region's doing great work. Rapid rehousing is something done in the United States more than here, but it's important. It's kind of housing first life. As soon as people become homeless, get them housed, and then short-term supports. Host homes are alternatives that keep people, particularly young people who leave home, in their communities. So they're still connected to school, to friends, to adults that are meaningful to them. And then finally, what we call duty to assist, which is the Welsh legislation that requires that when the local authority is aware somebody has become homeless, they have to offer help, and if accepted, resolve the homelessness within 2 months. So these are all exciting, and those that don't exist in Canada we need to adapt them. We've had conversations with some of our Indigenous partners about what would a duty to assist program look like to help people who are migrating to cities, so that as soon as they become engaged with services, immediately they get the kind of supports that are going to help them settle. And so these are exciting opportunities going forward to see what we can do. Now, in this area, there's one of the things that's really interesting is that there are data-informed approaches to prevention emerging. And these often use artificial intelligence. So in London, Ontario, they have a program called the Chronic Homelessness Artificial Intelligence Model, CHI. And what they've done is they have used artificial intelligence to look at their HIFIS data and compare those who enter homelessness and exit to those who enter homelessness and become chronically homeless. And using that modeling, they've been able to identify people who they think are going to be chronically homeless. And so that's exciting. And what's even more possible in the future is that rather than, because the good examples in Canada and the United States and Europe rely on the homelessness management information system data. But once we can really link administrative data effectively, like health data, child protection data, justice involvement, health, all of these things with the homelessness data, our ability to analyze and predict will improve. Now, I know that there are lots of concerns about artificial intelligence and machine learning, and we should be concerned about them, but these can be dealt with through how we govern these things and move forward. But it's certainly promising. There's lots of great work happening in Canada. Cheryl Forchuk's been doing work in this area. Help Seeker is a big leader in thinking about how do we use data and technology to address homelessness and prevention. So we're kind of on the cusp of something new, so fasten your seatbelts. That work they're doing in London, Ontario, there's no reason why that couldn't be applied in other communities in Canada. And then finally, housing stabilization. How do we ensure when people exit homelessness that they don't return to homelessness? And it requires the wraparound supports and housing stabilization. So Housing First, of course, is a good example, including Housing First for Youth and permanent supportive housing. So up to now, we've gone through the typology, got some examples. We have the definition. The evidence base for prevention is growing. The knowledge, practical knowledge about how to do it is growing. And a lot of it's sitting right here in Canada. It's waiting for us to mobilize it. So going forward, what are some of the things we need to think about? First is Government of Canada, when they launched Reaching Home, that was the first government to ever identify prevention as a priority. So with Reaching Home, they developed mandatory outcomes, community level outcomes. These are things that people have to report back to Reaching Home on. And you'll notice that the second and the third are focused on prevention. So fewer inflows into homelessness and fewer returns to homelessness. And we're hoping that they'll adopt the secondary prevention piece about fewer people entering the system who become chronically homeless. It's a place to start. Now communities need support in learning what to do. Now, the homelessness prevention amongst Indigenous people is really key, and we have to pay a big deal of attention to this. With the observatory, we've been working on building relationships across Canada. That takes time. There's a lot of trust building that's important there, but it's absolutely exciting how it changes the way you think about everything, and it's marvelous work. We're funding some research on examples of homelessness prevention right now that are Indigenous led. We're engaging communities across Canada to identify examples of Indigenous homelessness prevention and what that looks like. And our new report, which will be released in the spring, that summarizes all of this information, will really have an Indigenous lens to the work. Now, I'm also going to talk here about the prevention of youth homelessness. Now, this, for many people, might seem like, why are we wanting to do that? Many communities don't have much in the way of youth homelessness services and supports. Many of them don't support people until they're 18 or 21. And so why would we focus on young people? They're pretty robust after all, aren't they? But here's some things that we need to think about. Youth homelessness is very different from adult homelessness in terms of its causes and conditions. And I'm just going to throw a couple of stats out here from our research in large-scale pan-Canadian surveys with young people experiencing homelessness. So this is the first one. When we did our study without a home, this is the data that struck me the most. 40% of currently homeless youth had their first experience before they were 16 years old. And that's unattached. That's not being homeless with their family. Now, that group of people who had the early experiences of homelessness are very different than those who had their first experience at 16 or older. You can read here, you know, more likely to have multiple experiences of homelessness, more likely to be involved in child protection, to have learning disabilities, experiencing bullying, but also more likely to be chronically homeless as a teenager. So that's important. We got to think about that. And here's another one that I mentioned before. 58% of young people who are in the sector or in shelters are had involvement in child protection. So there's a connection there in terms of prevention that we can address through collaboration with child protection services. So the other thing is the research, and there's research on Canada on this, that young people who exit homelessness, if they don't have proper supports, they don't do well. They're not recovering. They're not engaging in employment and education. They're not overcoming social exclusion. They're hungry, and they often return to homelessness. And data from Toronto is very interesting. So this chart here shows outflows into homelessness. And the highest level of outflow is amongst families and refugees and chronic homelessness due to very targeted efforts. Youth are below the average, as are Indigenous people, single adults, that kind of thing. So youth are not successfully exiting homelessness. But watch this. Of those that do exit homelessness, the rate of return to homelessness is higher than for any other age group. So I want you to think about that. And then I'm going to move now to some data from the Government of Canada, from their own point in time count. So we asked them prior to the 2018 point in time count to ask the question, how old were you when you first experienced homelessness? And they found, through looking at all the PIT counts in Canada, that 50% of all people who experience homelessness had their first experience before they were 25 years old. So they were young people, they were young adults, adolescents. And so they put together a table. This is my favorite graph of 2022, where they showed at what age are most people having their first experience. And so look here. This is spread out across the whole age spectrum. When do people first experience homelessness? And you'll note that there's a big spike between the age of 12 and 20. 12 and 20. That's when the bulk of people are experiencing homelessness for the first time. And what do? Not enough, right? For those who are 12 to 16, we do nothing. Most communities in Canada don't have any homelessness supports for young people at that age. And people think that child protection will take it up. It depends on the jurisdiction, but they're not really designed to do that kind of support work and often aren't mandated. So for the people who are 16 to 25, we mostly offer the crisis response. There are some housing programs, transitional housing programs, a number of Housing First for Youth programs, but not much. And then what happens after that? For many of them, this is the pathway to chronicity. So in a sense, we're creating a system that produces chronicity by not paying attention to the needs of young people who are experiencing homelessness during their teen years. If we were to do a good job of addressing the homelessness of young people in their teens and focusing on well-being, not just are you housed or not only would we have a big impact on young people, but also on their families on the communities and society as a whole. And importantly, we would have a long-range, long-term impact on chronicity because we're turning the tap off right at the beginning. So what are we going to do about this knowledge? We can see that youth experience homelessness at a young age. The infrastructure is very uneven in Canada. It's often not a priority. What can we do? The Canadian Observatory on Homelessness, working with Away Home Canada, established Youth Homelessness Social Innovation Lab about 6 years ago. And our goal was to focus on identifying preventive interventions, testing them out, and developing a knowledge base about whether it works or not, without assuming that it will. Making the Shift funded 39 research projects in Canada focusing on the prevention of youth homelessness. 8 of them were focusing on the prevention of Indigenous youth homelessness. We've also run a number of demonstration projects across Canada where we test out preventive interventions that might have an evidence base in another country, but how does it work here? And so I'm just going to quickly go through this before we wrap up. So the first one is enhancing the family and natural supports, which I spoke about earlier. The reason why it matters is that when a young person winds up leaving home and winds up in the homelessness sector, the family is often seen part of the past and the problem. We think that enhancing family, it doesn't mean forcing young people to go to a household where they aren't safe or where they're experiencing abuse or neglect. But most young people in our research, those who are homeless, want stronger relationships with family. They just don't know where to start or how to sustain it. They also will have people in their life that are adults, but not necessarily family members, that have been very supportive. But when they wind up having to leave their community to go to where the homelessness services are, the ties are broken. So we need to work on this a lot. We need to think about school-based intervention. I mentioned Australia before. Now, why schools? Here's the thing. Every young person who experiences homelessness was at school once. And in many cases, teachers knew something was wrong, but didn't know what to do or weren't supported by the schools. And so there are a couple of classic great models that originated in Alberta and we're testing them out here in Canada. So one is called Reconnect. And what that involves is school community partnerships. So Reconnect workers have expertise in family and natural supports, in working with young people, and resources to help stabilize things. So they'll go into schools and talk to students at assembly. They'll talk to the teachers, the counselors, et cetera, at school. And so when a teacher notices, Johnny has been sleeping on the roof of the school, they now have a place to call for help. Or a young person goes, oh, I never thought that was homelessness when I was couch surfing at my friend's house for 2 months. The goal of that program is to help keep people in place in their communities, stabilize the living situation by addressing that problem, supporting young people and their families, a different way of thinking of the client, and enhancing school engagement. Upstream Project is similar to that with one difference. They use a confidential student needs assessment, a strengths-based assessment that everybody in the school gets, everybody. And they target the grades middle school, which is those 12, 13, 14, 15-year-olds who are becoming homeless. And once they do that, they find that they uncover all kinds of young people that the adults didn't know about, the teachers didn't know about. It's like, Susan, I thought she's getting A's in all her courses. I had no idea that there was a problem, because many young people will double down on school as a place of safety while they're going through all this. And then the supports are similar to what you get with Reconnect. And then finally, Housing First for Youth, and adaptation of Housing First to meet the needs of developing adolescents and young adults. The core principles of Housing First for Youth could guide your whole youth strategy, but we've done research and demonstration projects on Housing First for Youth that focuses on currently homeless youth. That is early intervention, partnering with child protection to help young people who are exiting care. And then finally, an Indigenous-led Housing First for Youth for Indigenous youth program. So all of these things are really good. And I'm going to close here with, is our communities ready? Right? Is prevention still seen as an outlier thing? So we did a needs assessment this year in Canada where we had over 150 service providers youth homelessness service providers fill out a survey on their attitudes about prevention and their knowledge of what to do. So we used, okay, so the one table I didn't have there, I'll just summarize. We asked them questions like, do you think prevention is necessary to ending youth homelessness? And over 90% of the respondents said yes, which kind of shocked us. We didn't realize there was that level of support. I mean, how many issues in Canada will 90% of people agree on? So they're very clear that they're supported and they are interested in doing it and want to learn more about how to do it. But they said they identified these problems. The communities within which they are situated are not always supportive of it. Youth homelessness isn't always a priority. They said they need dedicated funding to do it because otherwise it's an opportunity cost. If we're going to go down the road of prevention, what are we going to stop doing? They said they need training and technical assistance and ongoing support to implement things well. So they need to learn what to do and be supported, have people with experience doing these different interventions like Housing First for Youth walk with them and troubleshoot and answer questions. And then they need to be part of a learning community. So all of this was true. And so we also really explored where are they at in terms of the commitment curve, meaning that they know what this thing is, they know what upstream is, they want to do it. And so we did the commitment curve survey with all of the different interventions that we'd been working on. And we found fairly significant levels of people over 70% who over 40%, up to 50% almost, who were really wanting to do it, but they felt they needed training and technical assistance to help, and then others were not sure. So there's a lot of people out there who are interested in moving forward. They just need the supports. So to sum up, and then we're going to open for questions here. We've come a long way on prevention. I think our knowledge and understanding of its role in addressing homelessness and ending homelessness is becoming clearer and clearer. We just need to figure out how to support communities who are right now justifiably exhausted, having been through the pandemic and the growth in homelessness. But it's maybe at those kind of times where we need to make the biggest change possible. So I think now it's 12:46, so I'm 1 minute late, but we can now switch to questions if people have them. And I'll have a beverage.
All right, everyone. So once again, I invite you to ask your questions using the chat box below or the Q&A feature. We'll try to get through as many of these as we can. So the first question that I have, Steve, is somebody said, I didn't realize that mass homelessness first arose in the late 1980s. What changed to allow or cause homelessness, and how did we prevent it before then?
Well, there are two things. Well, they're all connected in a way. It was changes in attitudes about the role of government. So in the post-war period in Canada, leading right up to the late 1980s, they were building, Canada was investing in building over 18,000 units of social housing each year. And then they stopped. And what they did is using tax expenditures, they thought the private sector will probably be able to fill this need more efficiently, because that's that belief that it's always more efficient than government of Canada. So they stopped investing in building affordable housing. And then after 30 years, the results of that grand experiment were in, and we had a crisis. And we had 30 years of wasted time, right? Like, get your calculators out, 18,000 times 30. How many units of housing would that be if we'd stayed on that? The other thing is the population of Canada grew by a third, right? So that impact we're facing today, right? Like the outcomes of all of these changes and policy decisions made have led to this housing crisis that we have that underlies homelessness. The other thing that happened is in many provinces and territories, there are cutbacks on benefits. So in Ontario, they cut, welfare benefits, I think by 25%, and it's never recovered, right? So people have less money, things cost more, housing costs way more. And so we've kind of broken the safety net, right? And so those structural types of prevention that I mentioned at the beginning are really key, right? It can't just be interventions. So that happened, and the population started to grow through the 90s. Canada had its first homelessness strategy starting in 1999, right? Didn't need it before then. And here we are now 25 years later. Didn't realize it was the anniversary. But the lesson to be learned is that much of homelessness as a problem has been caused by policy and investment decisions. And so if we know how we created the problem, it should point to what should we do next. So, but that's a great question, because I think most people don't realize how recent this is. And that would be true in the United States and in England and other countries as well. Similar history.
100%. Okay, so connecting a little bit to the idea that it really does take a connected effort from multiple sides and not necessarily just housing services alone. Another question asked how important let me rephrase this. How addictions and mental health factor into this? Like, how important are they in the grand scheme of when we look at homelessness prevention and what supports are needed?
Yeah, I think it can be absolutely central. Many people experience homelessness in part or for major reasons because of a substance use disorder, right? So it means that it may lead to breakdown in relationships with family or loss of jobs, that kind of thing. But the other thing is, when people are exposed to homelessness, they're more likely to use substances and to cope with the pain, because experience of homelessness can be very, difficult for people, and people can experience trauma. People who are homeless are more likely to be victims of crime than people who are housed, even though it's them we often fear. So one of the outcomes is that people have trauma, their mental health problems increase, and people self-medicate. Like, I've never experienced homelessness myself, but I'm pretty sure I would rely on drugs and alcohol to get by because the pain would be too much. So it's absolutely important, but we have to support people in ways that make sense. And sometimes the public is not on board with the things that actually work. The evidence is, if you force people into treatment and they're not ready or they don't want to, it's not likely to work. Treatment works or can work when people are ready and have supports and aren't discharged back into the context that made them users in the first place. So we need to take a harm reduction approach that is very client driven. What does a person need? And we also need to focus on making sure that we have the adequate treatment facilities for those who want that, and people can get the help that they need. But it's not a one size fits all for people, and it should be part of it. Like, for instance, things like Housing First and Housing First for Youth, both are interventions that take a harm reduction focus. You can't be denied housing because you have a substance use issue, right? You can't be made homeless because you have a substance use issue. And so in our work on homelessness, whether it's the emergency services or prevention or, helping people before they become homeless, or helping people once they're homeless the first time, or when they leave, we have to really pay attention to doing these things in a supportive way. It's not easy work. There's no silver bullets here, but there's a need to apply what we are learning and have learned about how to successfully support people in those situations. It's a key part of prevention. Absolutely.
I hear you 100%. So there's a question here about defining what success or progress would actually look like. Somebody says, I'm an evaluator with the government of Nova Scotia. What are some key outcomes for measuring prevention? In other ways, what is the best way to measure impact in homelessness prevention?
There are different ways of coming at that. So one is to look at the level of the intervention, and there are lots of ways to measure gains or problems. We're in the middle of a randomized controlled trial on our Housing First for Youth program, and the outcome, we're following people for 48 months. And so the outcomes that we've outlined and that we're measuring are showing some really promising results, so that, you know, what it can lead to, a good intervention is a focus on well-being, not just giving the people the keys and then leaving. So that's important. At a systems level, that will take a while because, you know, where it can most certainly show up is, you know, when people show up at the shelter and we're doing shelter diversion, are we simply postponing their homelessness or actually diverting it? So we have to design those kind of things going forward on that kind of level. And if we focused on the youth homelessness piece, you know, where we would be seeing the changes would show up in the HIFAS data when we see entries to homelessness and the ages of people. So there's lots of different ways of doing it. I'm a big believer in evaluation. It tells us whether things work or how they don't work. But with that knowledge, we can continuously improve the interventions going forward.
Okay. Oh, we've had a question just come in at the bottom of the chat here. So how do we make a shift in governmental policies and public feelings about homelessness?
I think the shift in government policy, like, talk to them and say that we should be doing this. I think there's lots of sympathetic ears around it. I think we need to get all orders of government on board with prevention. The provinces and territories control a lot of the public institutions. Constitutionally, they're responsible for them. That could have a big impact on homelessness, healthcare, child protection, part of the criminal justice system, and so provinces could be more strategic in aligning the work of their different ministries. The premier of a province gives mandate letters to every ministry with instructions. What are they expected to focus on? If you had a whole of government approach, you could really get things going. And, so healthcare system, you have to report back annually on what you're doing to reduce discharges into homelessness. These kind of things you could do going forward. But we also have to, I think one thing with prevention, I'm going to tell you a quick story. We have time. So we all went through this pandemic, right? And it was really tough, right? I don't think anyone, well, maybe there's probably some people out there who are like, it was great, but I don't think so. And we learned a lot about prevention, and a lot of it was controversial. Not everyone buys in, right? But we learned that we need personal protection devices, so people wear masks. Many people still wear them. We learned things like keeping, hygiene. We had lockdowns, so in cases people were ordered to stay at home. And then we had vaccines, right? And over time, applying all of those different things, we really made progress, and I think there was public support for the most part. Maybe not in places like Florida, but we're not responsible for that. So that's important. Now, if you were to say, what if we treated the pandemic the way we treated homelessness? You'd say, here's what it would look like. There'd be no personal protection equipment. There'd be no lockdowns. There'd be no rules. There'd be no vaccine. But you know what there would be? Investment in building a really big waiting room at emergency rooms of hospitals for people to get sick and come and wait. And then when they're in the emergency room, they have to wait even more because there's not enough physicians, right? So what if we took that same thinking and flipped it around? So what if we treated homelessness like a pandemic? What if we said it's a pandemic? It's not a homelessness crisis. we would be motivated to work quickly as possible. In the US, they had their plan to develop the vaccine called Operation Warp Speed. We would work using evidence to ensure that people have the best solutions that would end their homelessness and protect them from becoming homeless in the first place, and helping them, if they do become homeless, help them exit and make sure that things don't get worse. If we took that approach, it would reframe everything, because right now we're just, in a sense, we've created a situation where we're kind of warehousing people for a long time before they get help. And that would never work for a pandemic. So why can't we do it in that case? And so if we learn that in terms of the organizations that work with homelessness, if we learn that if in the communities that we all live in, and think about that, it's a way of thinking differently.
Okay. We're right on the hour, but I think we might have time for just one more. So there's a lot of questions that are kind of speaking to this idea that I'm going to summarize here. But there's a lot of people in the chat talking about, like, there's a lot of us who understand, right, this need for prevention, and understand that there's a need for a different approach that is more proactive than reactive. And yet here we are, right?
Yeah.
So what do you think are some of the barriers that are kind of interfering with that? And
Well,
like, how could we address them?
I think it's a change management question, right? Like, my belief is that as much as people hate the present, they're often more fearful of the future, of change, right? And so it takes time, because people are used to thinking a certain way about how to do things. They may enjoy it, or they may worry that if we move to prevention, they'll lose their jobs, that kind of thing. I think, and so it does take time. This one thing I've learned is we have to be more patient, but I think we've made some big progress in Canada over the last 5 or 6 years that are worth noting. We have a government of Canada that's supporting prevention. We have more knowledge about prevention growing all the time, about how to do it. And we have more people that are getting it. So that convergence, at some point, that's got to lead to a place where the funding is aligned to the work on prevention. And so we need the philanthropic sector to support this, because philanthropic sector can often be much more flexible and support innovation. We need people testing it out in their communities. And we need to ignite people's curiosity. So if you're interested in learning more, like, check it out and see where that learning's going to go. The series that we're launching is intended to give people ideas about how these things can look. So stay tuned for those. We're going to be working to ensure that as many people in Canada can learn about prevention of homelessness as possible, and make it as easy as possible to learn. I know sometimes our reports are really long, but we're going to produce a lot of content that's going to just help you think about it yourself, but also help help others think about it, right? By talking with your colleagues or your bosses or your staff or your member of parliament about it, and really help, like, government can do a lot of things, but they often need help. And if they know if they know which way the wind's blowing, then they're going to be more motivated to do dedicated things.
I hear 100%. And on that note, we're right at the hour. So I'm going to close this out. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today and staying engaged right until the end. You've been super engaged in the chat, and I really appreciate that. We look forward to seeing you for more sessions in the near future. Once again, our next session is going to be on Black youth homelessness prevention to commemorate Black History Month. So please keep a close eye on our newsletter and our socials in order to stay updated about how you can register and what's to come. I have posted the newsletter link in the chat, so you can sign up there, or if you're rewatching this on YouTube, it will be down in the description box below. But otherwise, we thank you so much for joining us today, and we'll see you next month or whenever you're next able to be.
Just to clear, this will be posted then on YouTube?
Yeah.
Thank you, everyone.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, it'll be on YouTube, and everybody who registered will also be provided with the video link once it's ready. All
And
right,
spread
then.
it around
Share it
like a
far and
virus.
wide. All right,
Thank
take care, everyone.
Bye.